Wonderful. Well, hello everyone. My name is Nina Cross. I am the research manager for the Center for Guaranteed Income Research at the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. On behalf of the Global Income Security Network, I welcome you to our third webinar entitled From Dependency to Self-Reliance, a New Welfare Paradigm for Strengthening Work Welfare Connections and Eliminating Blind Spots. The purpose of today's webinar is to hear about a variety of studies from social welfare experts around the world. I would like to thank the Seoul Metropolitan Government and especially Ms. Yoon-Ha Lee for organizing our panel of exciting speakers today. I'm happy to welcome our esteemed panelists to the webinar today. During this webinar, we are going to hear from 4 scholars. First, Professor Kirsten Senbrook, Distinguished Policy Fellow at the International Inequalities Institute at the London School of Economics. Ms. Senbrook's work examines social, labor, and development policies around the world. Previously, she was a research fellow at the Universidad de Chile, director of the Institute for Public Policy at the Universidad Diego Portales in Chile, and lecturer at the University of California at Berkeley. Next, we will hear from Dr. Pasi Moisio. Dr. Moisio is a research professor at the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare, also known as THL, and an associate professor at the University of Turku. He leads the THL contribution to the Invest Research flagship, which aims to renew the Finnish welfare state. Dr. Moisio has extensive experience as a social policy expert for the Finnish government and the European Union. He is currently serving as the chair of the Parliamentary Social Security Committee for the period of 2020 to 2027. Our third presenter is Ms. Mira Phillips, a PhD candidate in social welfare at the School of Social Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania. In addition to being a PhD candidate, Mira is also a doctoral research assistant at the Center for Guaranteed Income Research at the School of Social Policy and Practice. Her dissertation research concerns the experience of migrant care workers in her home city of Toronto, Canada. At CJR, she primarily contributes to research on the intersections of cash transfers, caregiving, and migration in the United States. Finally, we will hear from Dr. Gumsun Byun, a research fellow at Urban Society for the Urban Society Research Division at the Seoul Institute. Dr. Byun received her PhD in social welfare from Seoul National University. Her primary research interests include life course changes, poverty and inequality, youth, and longitudinal studies. After we hear from Dr. Byun, we will hold a question and answer session with our panelists. And with that, I pass the virtual microphone to our first presenter, Professor Kirsten Senbrook.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's great to be here, great to meet you all. Since we have little time, I'm going to go straight into the presentation and share my screen, hopefully the right one, yep. So I'm going to be talking about poor quality employment in Europe, including the UK, I hasten to add. And in particular, I would like to sort of emphasize 3 key takeaways from the presentation. And these, I think, are particularly important from a policy perspective. First of all, looking at unemployment rates and wages, which is how we tend to focus on labour markets, sort of in its most reduced form, isn't enough. We need to look beyond that to employment conditions because they are also changing very rapidly. Second, the other key important thing is that employment conditions are cumulative. And what I mean by that is people in low-wage jobs tend to also have poor other employment conditions, and people in high-wage jobs tend to have other good employment conditions. And that's something that we don't really take into account enough from a policy perspective. And the third key issue is that our welfare states, in whichever shape or form they exist, and our social protection policies, benefits, etc., they all depend on sustainable labour markets, whether it be through tax revenue, through contributions to social security systems, and so on. And so if our labour markets are precarious, we are literally building houses on sand. I'd also like to emphasize that this approach is absolutely global. So the way we approach this topic is, first of all, from an inclusive perspective. It's designed to make sure that we include all workers, especially the most vulnerable. It can be applied at a regional, national, global, local level, provided there's data availability. And the other thing is that what's really important is that global labour markets are converging for a number of different reasons. Advanced economies are often seeing practices or employment conditions that we normally only know from developing countries, and also vice versa. So again, what is important about the approach that I'm going to present is that we can apply it anywhere. So just a brief introduction. We don't really compare jobs and employment conditions very well. If you have three workers who are all precarious, the typical thing that social policy looks at is their income, and doesn't really take into account other employment conditions. And if you have three workers with comparable income levels or working more hours, and therefore gaining more income, but earning the same amount per hour, we don't really have a method for comparing these jobs, these workers, and determining who has the best job and who has the worst job. So really that's what this method is about. And the same goes, of course, for countries. So we can have low-wage countries, we can have countries with higher wages but high job insecurity. You can have countries that have, a combination of other factors. You could do the same with cities. So one city has, higher wages, the other one has more precarious conditions, etc. So we don't really have a way for comparing these things, and that's exactly what this method does. So with every job, there's an associated set of employment conditions, what we generally refer to as job quality. And within that group of workers, there will be a group of workers that I would describe as having poor quality employment. And what I want to emphasize is that these are not necessarily the same workers as those who are just low income. So the low income circle here is actually the smallest because they are a subgroup of this bigger group of workers who have poor quality employment. And I'm not going to spend much time on methodology. Basically, what we've done is we've developed a method that is very established in the literature that looks at individual employment conditions and aggregates them. So in Europe, I have a lot of information on working conditions. In the United States, a similar survey was applied a few years ago. And we can look at variables associated with income, duration, contract, and whether people are exposed to unpleasant working conditions or hazardous conditions, whether they have some degree of autonomy, what kind of hours they work. So we know that all of these conditions are really important to workers. And what we do is we basically establish cutoff lines. So if somebody's earning below the minimum wage or below a living wage, if jobs are too unstable, we would consider that to be precarious. If they have no contract, or in most countries, you have to have a signed formal contract. If they don't have that, then that would be a sign of precarity, and so on. If people are affected in some shape or form in their working conditions, and have negative working conditions, we would consider that. I'm not going to have time to go into the methodology of how we aggregate that, but I'm happy to answer any questions about this. This is an overview of Europe, different countries, and these different variables. The problem is, if you're a policymaker now, imagine this were a list of cities. You would find it very hard to think about a policy if, some of these variables might be quite good, others might be quite bad. How does this all fit together? And that's exactly what we've developed as a method. So we've developed a method for aggregating these variables, looking at individual dimensions and indicators. And then we've made definitions, we've defined definitions that say, okay, this is a good job, or this is a good condition, and this is a precarious one. Now, from us, this is just a methodological suggestion. This has been applied quite widely in the international literature, but really every local country or city or region has to define its own matrix here, and this very much depends on the data that's available. But the main thing is that this has to go through some sort of expert discussion, democratic consensus to establish an overall measure. And what we then do is we aggregate these dimensions with these variables to determine an overall indicator. And this will show you what this indicator looks like for European countries. So you will see that there's quite a lot of variety. We have data here from 2 different years, 2010, 2015. And we have the usual suspects that have better job quality or higher poor quality employment, and countries that do that have a lower level of job quality. However, many countries are not where you would expect them to be because employment regulation is so very different from country to country. What's really important about this is this cumulative effect that I mentioned from the outset. So if you look at these right bars, the top level is the absolute level of deprivation in a labour market. People who are low income and have poor quality employment conditions, no contract, informal, unstable jobs, and so on. And as you can see, these bars become more intensely red towards the top. What that basically means is that the more red parts of these columns, those are the people who are most intensely deprived. So people who are deprived in multiple conditions at the same time. What that means for policy making is that those people require more support. Another way of showing you this is the same thing, but where the red part shows you only those people who are income deprived. And then the different blue bars show you whether they have one other deprivation, two other deprivations, or three in their employment conditions. And it gives you an idea again of how intensely people are deprived. Workers who are unionized, just very briefly to summarize, workers who are unionized are less likely to be deprived in terms of their employment conditions, and vice versa. So I hope I stuck within the time limit there. I did make this very brief. Any questions, I'd be very, very happy to answer in the discussion. And also any questions with regard to clarifications. Maybe if somebody wants to ask anything now, that's also very welcome.
Thank you, Professor Stenbrook. That was excellent. I think we'll hold questions for the end. We now turn to Dr. Pasi Moisio for his presentation.
So my motivational background is that Finland nationalized its basic income assistance in 2017. It was actually unique reform at the time, and stepping stone is, to my knowledge, the only similar reform where they tried to nationalize or centralize the social assistance system in all. So this provides very interesting comparative setting for studying these kind of reforms and impacts. So this is my motivation, more or less. So welfare states models or regimes, this might be a bit simplistic for those who know this more, so I apologize. But welfare regimes, and they are considered to be the overall institutional systems through which society is organized to social protection and defines their citizens' right to social security and healthcare and social care. And different countries evolved their welfare state or these welfare arrangements, of course, in a different historical context, different phase of industrialization and social movements, and etc., etc. So this had led at least what is called in European Western literature, these three models of welfare, which are liberal, Bismarckian, and Nordic welfare models. And a bit later, there was a more discussion that there should be the fourth model, East Asian model, which is sometimes called productivist model, where the industrialization and the building of welfare state took place at the same time. So there was more emphasis on the economic role compared to these traditional three models. And again, my slide seems to be stopped again. Okay. Yes. Policies, it's very small font, just to give you an overview. The liberal or residual welfare models, which often considered to, example case of United Kingdom, United States, Canada, it's more market orientated and has a stronger work incentive, so to speak, and finance based in general taxation. And coverage logic is mainly means testing and selective, and the primary welfare provider considered to be individual, family, or market. The conservative or Bismarckian model, which is Central European, if you want to say, Germany, France, Austria, Belgium, the example case. It's more employment and statute-based logic that it has. It preserve the family and occupational roles. And its financing is mostly on social insurance contributions. The coverage logic is occupational groups and workers. And the primary welfare providers considered to be the family and employers and insurance funds. And the third one is the social democratic or Nordic model with more universal residence-based entitlement logic in there. Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, often seen the example countries. It's finance-based, primarily taxation, but some earnings-related insurance on top of it. The coverage logic is universal. It's all residents and it's based on individual rights. It's not a program-based like in the United States, for example, or in the UK, mostly, by many cases. And its primary provider is a state. And the fourth one is the East Asian or productivist welfare model. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, example cases. Welfare is might say subordinated to economic growth and productivity, and its enterprises have a strong role together with families. The financing base is social insurance and employers and also family. And the coverage logic is workers in the formal sector and families in only means testing. And the primary welfare providers is family, but also enterprises. This is all, it's a bit of a different from the three previous models. So what have happened since establishing these 3 or 4 different welfare models in 90s mostly? More and more research have came in publication where they say that the welfare states have become more hybrid. So the more and more countries have a distinct from different models across OECD countries. Many say that Finland, for example, is example of this beverage Bismarck type of hybrid. We have a strong universal based top on that is topped up by earnings-related insurance. And South Korea, with the Stepping Stone project, I would say that it's also similar kind of a hybridization. Where South Korean model is integrating more these universal elements to its welfare model. And quickly the social security structures between Finland and South Korea. The structure in South Korea is based on the 3 pillars. You have a social insurance, social services, including health services, and public aid safety net. And if I understand correctly, the health sector is not entirely public, but please correct me if I got it wrong. But in Finland instead, you have a universal social insurance. This is also a bit different. You have a mandatory social insurance covering everyone, and then you have a tax-financed basic security layer, and you have a public services, including public health services. And financing in South Korea is mainly funded by social insurance of employees and employers' contributions, and then income support from taxes. And in Finnish case, it's largely tax funded, and the earnings-related social insurance schemes is topping up the tax funding system. And administration Sorry, please correct me, my colleague from South Korea. It's highly fragmented system. There's multiple ministries and agency, at least appear to me. Compared to Finland as a kind of a typical prototype of Nordic model, where they have a very coordinated or centralized. You have a Kela, that is the social insurance fund for basic benefits, and then you have a very coordinated insurance funds related to handling the earnings-related pension. I'm running out of time, so I'm trying to steam. This is the structure of Korea's social security system, and you can see that it's based on the three pillars. You have a social insurance pillar, and then you have the safety net or social assistance or public aid pillar on the left, and then you have a social services in the middle. And if you compare to Nordic model, that is in Finnish case, you have a four pillars. So you have a basic security pillar there between the social insurance and public aid, and also social services. And this basic security layer is very typical for the Nordic model. That means that you have individual tax-funded non-contributory benefits that are one-to-one or very closely related to actual social insurance benefits and risk-based. So meaning that for those who don't have a work history or doesn't have an entitlement to earnings-related pension, you have tax-funded minimum benefits covering the same social risks as the mandatory social insurance system. And this is kind of a unique, and this makes the Nordic model universal, so to speak. And of course, the public aid, if you want to see that, you have the also the social assistance and housing allowance. They are all residence-based. They are not categorical. And also services are universal. They are residence-based, so you have a public healthcare and etc. etc. So Korea's reform. This is my last slide. This is a bit of a bold statement. Is Korea moving towards Nordic model or logic? So at least it appeared to me that stepping stone reform is clearly moving the Korea's welfare systems towards more Nordic style logic by increasing tax financing, by introducing the details, and also expanding social insurance coverage to low-income groups, and integrating income support with the insurance schemes. So I'm open to debate on this, my bold statement. And Finland provides interesting comparison here, because Finland started from the universalism, and actually it's in the second phase that is actually trying to fine-tune its system to meet the new social and economic conditions for aging population, immigration, long-term unemployment, and then change of family structure, and etc. etc. So yeah, I think I'll stop here, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moisio. I'm glad that you got your slides working, because I think that was very valuable for many of us. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
We will now turn to Mira Phillips for her presentation.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you to Dr. Yunao Lee and the Seoul Metropolitan Government for inviting me to present today. So today I'm going to be presenting on two of CGIR's pilots that have a particular focus on caregiving. So these studies, highlight what is the utility of unconditional cash experiments for rectifying caregiver burdens. And I do want to note that some of the findings that I'm going to be discussing are found through a lot of our sites, even if those sites are not particularly focused on caregivers. And I think it shows the burdens that caregivers experience. But I'm highlighting these two for the purposes of time, but also because there was a particular focus on this population. So I'm looking at Los Angeles County and San Diego County. So in Los Angeles, 12 women working as paid and unpaid caregivers received $1,000 a month for 1 year. And so some of these women were working in the paid care economy. They were unpaid caregivers for their families or other dependents. But some of them also received compensation through California's in-home supportive services program to care for their family members. So IHSS is a program where individuals who need care can receive compensation from the state to hire anybody. So it could be a nurse or a friend or a family member. In San Diego, 150 families received $500 a month for 2 years. So these were families who were custodial caregivers to children under 12. They also needed to live in one of 4 zip codes in San Diego County. And these zip codes were chosen because they are predominantly, the people who predominantly live there tend to be low income and marginalized populations. And I want to note that in both of these pilots, a large number of our participants were first or second generation immigrants. They were living in mixed status households, so that definitely complicates a lot of their experience. And speaking also about Los Angeles, you will note that our sample size is small. So this was considered a micro pilot to test the feasibility of unconditional cash on this particular population. So we have a set of general research questions that guide all of our pilots, but I really wanted to hone in on other research questions that we used for the LA pilot, which was really looking at what does GI mean for paid and unpaid caregivers? So how can it disrupt the physical and emotional and financial toll of low paid and unpaid care? How does it alter the perceptions of deservedness and belonging amongst this population? And how does it function alongside existing policies and familial resources? So I won't spend too much time on the methods, but I will say that all of my findings that I'm displaying here are from the qualitative portions of these studies, so not the quantitative portion. So to begin, we coined the term fragility by proxy, and this was in reference to the Los Angeles pilot, but it definitely applies to San Diego and many of our other pilots where we have caregivers. And so fragility by proxy essentially means the erosion of one's well-being due to the burdens of care work, and in particular, due to the burdens of caring for one's family members. So many of our participants were sandwich generation, so they were caring for children and parents at the same time. And a result of this care and the lack of support that they received as caregivers, they experienced chronic health issues, heart disease, anxiety, stress, social isolation, lack of sleep. And these were really acute for immigrants who were dealing not just with the difficulties of providing care, but also having left their home countries, often being separated from other family members, and also being expected to provide care for family members abroad. So a lot of our participants also indicated that a lot of these burdens were a result of gendered norms. So the women in the Los Angeles study often talked about their caregiving as being an obligation, something that they had to do out of love because it was expected of them as women. And so they didn't really feel like they could protest, that they could discuss the anxieties and burdens they experienced because they thought, well, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And even in San Diego, where we had male participants and women participants, a lot of the men really showcased more choice and autonomy in how they organized their care, whereas women were really expected to prescribe to the sort of good mothering ideas of caregiving. We also saw a lot of the burdens from the neoliberal expectations for caregiving. So what I mean by this is that there's expectation now that parents are self-reliant, that they support their families on their own without help from the state, that they do anything and everything to care for their children, that they become entrepreneurial in their care. And this creates a lot of anxiety and stress for individuals who do not have the monetary resources to provide this type of care. So you can see from the quotes that we have here, and I want to highlight one in particular from V, who is a single mother in San Diego, and I note that these are all pseudonyms. So she says, like, I provide, of course, I get frustrated, I get freaked out, but I also tell, like, going back to therapy, my therapist was like, you're so resilient, you're so strong. But then who else is going to do this? Who else do those kids have? So what she's really highlighting is that this sort of self-reliance entrepreneurial mindset is forced on her. You know, she has to do this for her children because there's nobody else that will be able to do this because the state is not supporting her enough. So the second finding across both sites is the price tag of care, so the material costs of what it means to be a caregiver. So a lot of participants experienced time and logistical trade-offs, and this was particularly acute for immigrants in both sites, but also the IHSS providers that I talked about in Los Angeles. So these individuals are having to negotiate very complex systems, administrative burdens, and this is especially fraught for immigrants who are concerned about their status, losing their status, deportation. And so they're spending a lot of time and strategizing on how are they getting the benefits for the people that they care for. So we see a quote from Maria, who cares for her mother, talking about the difficulties of recertification for Medicare because it's not a process that happens automatically. And then there's, of course, the cost of healthcare and daily living. So they're spending a lot of their material resources on purchasing items for families that might have disabilities, such as, medical vans to take them to hospital visits. And so a lot of their income is going towards this because despite the fact that California has a relatively robust social welfare system, there's still a lot of gaps. So they're having to cover these costs themselves. So when we look at the strategies that our participants are using to cope, first we find that many experience forced and chosen vulnerability. So forced vulnerability means that they are pushed into situations that they may not have otherwise chosen to get by. So as an example, Nicole, who was a participant in Los Angeles, had to live with her parents because she could not afford rent in LA. And as many of you probably know, California has extremely high cost of living. But she had a very complicated and toxic relationship with her family. And so that was a source of stress for her. Other participants chose a level of vulnerability. And this is not necessarily a negative thing. This is participants deciding that they would rather have some independence as opposed to being pushed into situations that they feel like they have no autonomy over. So as an example, some participants will say that they refused help from their family and friends because being independent was more important to them. Even though if they had accepted that help, they might have, been better off. Many, especially women, structured their paid employment around their care responsibilities. So you can see a quote from Esther here in San Diego about taking on part-time work so that she could care for her sons. Some also, unfortunately, had to exit paid employment, and some welcomed that, but others, felt like that was not a choice that they would have made, but that was the only way to undertake their care responsibilities. And in San Diego in particular, we actually found that a lot of the women were talking about paid work as a reprieve from unpaid work. So they felt disappointment in having to exit the labor market to undertake their care responsibilities because they saw their paid work as enabling them to take a break from all of the unpaid care burdens that they had. While they loved their children, they loved their families, they also felt like it took a lot of their time, identity, and was a cause of stress. And so going to work was something that they felt really helped their mental health. But of course, this was complicated by having to then exit paid employment or reduce paid employment in order to provide care. So when we look to the impact of guaranteed income, we discuss it in terms of enabling proximate security. So it really it had an impact, certainly, but it was more of a short-term impact. So a lot of participants used the income to pay for care-related costs. They were able to reduce working hours. And what I mean by this is many of our participants, particularly in Los Angeles, were working 2 to 3 jobs or working overtime. And so with the GI, they were able to reduce their hours, quit the second job, and then spend more time with their family. GI also enabled or gave them the time and the resources to look for more stable employment that was more conducive to caring for their family, that was less precarious, that had better benefits. And as a result, it really upended in a positive way familial relations because parents could spend more time with their children or spend more time with their parents or their siblings or other people in their family because they weren't working so much. So in effect, it really enabled participants to reclaim humanity. So they were able to think about themselves and fashion themselves outside of this sort of capitalist burnout culture where you have to work at any cost. They were able to see themselves beyond just being a worker or beyond just being a caregiver because they had the time and space to take care of themselves, to participate in activities, for leisure, for fun that, had meaning making that they might not otherwise have had the possibility to do because they did not have the income and they did not have the time. And it really did support community care and reciprocity. So we especially saw that in San Diego, where families were able to support others in their community with this additional income. So they were able to give back to people that had supported them in the past. And that really did give them a real sense of purpose and a real sense of meaning. So we see this quote from Anna, which talks about that. And of course, we also see the material impacts of GI on some things like housing. And again, San Diego and Los Angeles have incredibly high cost of living. And so the GI did enable them to support their families and to pay housing costs in a situation where without the GI, they were really struggling to get by. So in conclusion, I really want to talk about some of the things that participants were questioning. And these were both participants in the treatment group and the control group who were not receiving the GI. But we really saw a questioning of structural inequality, people questioning the American dream. And the American dream is all about self-reliance, independence, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. But a lot of participants were saying, we work really hard, but we're not getting anywhere. And they were recognizing that the system was set up against them. And this is a really interesting finding. It's a really kind of big reversal on the importance of the American dream in US society. People realizing that their struggles were not the result of not working hard enough, but because they did not have the resources that the state should technically be providing. And you see that in Sandra's quote here from Los Angeles. We also found that guaranteed income, when layered on top of the social safety net, enabled some resistance to both these sort of neoliberal ideas of what it means to be a parent, what it means to be productive, as well as the gendered scripts regarding care. So the idea that especially as a mother, you need to be providing care on your own at any cost. However, we also find that GI was limited in fostering long-term financial security or resistance for the simple fact that often the amount of money and the duration was not enough. So GI did work. It did have a positive impact for a short period of time, but we also have to take into account the larger system in which GI was existing. We have to think about the gaps in the safety net. So as an example, many of our participants in Los Angeles, were using their money to pay for care, their GI to pay for care. And they were questioning, well, what could we use this cash for if there was a better social safety net that we didn't have to use it for care? What else could we be doing? And as far as resistance, people were thinking about their role within capitalism. They were thinking about structural inequality, but the reality is that they still had all of these responsibilities, so they couldn't really resist that. They were aware of it, but they still had to do all of these things. So as I quoted before, one of our participants said, well, who else is going to do this? So I think a lot of what we believe at CGIR is that GI is not a solution on its own to a lot of the issues that we're seeing, at least in the United States, as far as poverty. It's something that needs to be worked in conjunction with other supports in order to make a real difference. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ms. Phillips. That was a really enlightening look at your work and a little bit of our work at the center at UPenn as well. We are now going to hear from our final presenter, Dr. Byun.
Hi, my name is Kim Sun, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to share my research with you today. And first of all, I'd like to thank the organizer for inviting me to this seminar. This research is a little bit a scholar or more academic issues, but very a little bit micro data research. So please, so I'm start. Yeah. Can you see this presentation? Is it okay? Okay. The research is about the effect of household income on leaving the parental home among South Korean young adults. And this shows that in South Korea, the poverty rate has been going down and welfare expenditures have been going up. However, Korean people to die due to severe poverty. 2014, mother and two daughters died for severe poverty. They suicide by suicide. And 2022, Suwon, mother and two daughters, and again, mother and daughter died in 2023 in Seoul. So, although the overall poverty rate is decreasing, you see this graph, why these tragic events occur again and again in South Korea. There are two reasons: blind spots and life transitions. The blind spots refer to high qualification and administrative system. The problem is that the system is not flexible enough to address poverty risk effectively. People go through the several or various life events that can increase their risk of poverty. However, the existing policies didn't seem to work. So why did that happen? And let's see the cases, details of the cases. They were all female-headed household and all those children living together and working-aged family. So the study attempt to shed light on poverty and economic difficulties of young people living with their parents and cannot become independent. In 2022 case, the oldest An eldest child became the head of family at the age of 25 after his father passed away, and he died of illness at the age of 45. Since then, his two daughters, two young sisters, and mother have committed suicide by severe poverty. And we can see the poverty risk among young adults. Recent data confirm the poverty risk among young people has been increased in OECD countries, and this shows that in South Korea. This trend also evident in South Korea. And you can see the why is poverty risk increased among young adults. Prolonged young adulthood and increasing poverty risk. Although legally considered adults at 18 or 19, they now have prolonged period of transition to independence or to working in labor market. This prolonged early adulthood increased their vulnerability to poverty, especially for those without parental support, financial support. They faced various difficulties to independent from their parents. So we speculate that delays in young adult independence occur in different contexts and depending on household income of their parental house. So independent from parents in young adulthood is very important issues in South Korea and in young adults poverty. So we can question about this. Does the probability of leaving the parental home during young adulthood vary depending on parental household income? And as you know, previous studies report that living with parents lowers the risk of poverty because the family financial support. But young Koreans typically leave their parental home, and almost of them are ready to start, and they have got financial independence. Most Korean young people prepare for independence by living with their parents, not leaving parents. However, as in the case discussed before, it can be challenging for adult children who grow up in economically disadvantaged household. For young adult children from low-income families especially, living with their parents may be a burden rather than buffer. So we have two hypotheses. The first one is buffer effect, and second one is burden effect. Buffer effect means that higher parental income status will be associated with a lower probability of leaving home early for young adulthood. And second one, burden effect means lower parental income status will be associated with a lower probability of leaving home early. The analytical strategy and method is let's pass. I used the panel data and adopt a survival analysis, Kaplan-Meier analysis, and Cox proportional hazard model to capture the bias by sensor data. This shows the data, the Korean welfare panel data, and I used the household level panel survey, including a sufficient number of cases for low-income household. And the subject is 2,788 born between 1981 and 1991. Number of observation is this, and observing living parental home between the ages of 19 and 41, sensor survival time data by the individual biological age. This figure 9 shows that the average age of living parents in the lower income group was lower than that of parents in the higher income group. However, it's important to note that this result not take into account cutoff data or elapsed time. And this shows the result of survival analysis. Average age living home is 229 years old, and 41% of young adults leave parental home until 41. And the figure 11 shows that young adults in low-income household are less likely, less likely to leave their parents' home. This suggests that failure to achieve independence from parents may prolong poverty among young adults. And this shows the result of Koch's proportional hazard model. This shows that Model 1 and Model 2, you can see the Model 1 and Model 2 show that young people from low-income households are less likely to leave their parents' home. However, when transition events such as education, like this, education and economic states add the variable, it's a little bit have changes. In particular, Model 4 had a significantly better model fit than Model 3, indicating that achieving independence in Korea is primarily associated with marriage, marriage. And this result shows that buffer effect, and you can see the if parents' income is high, the hazard of leaving home decreases as household income increases. This trend remains consistent even when transition event variables are added. This one and model 6, 7, 8, 9, and add by the more variables of transition events. Parental household income acts as a buffer, providing additional time for high-income children to prepare their jobs or other things. And this one shows that burden effect for young people, low-income household, only for low-income household young adults, there was little correlation, this one, between income and leaving home. Although the direction was negative, it can be inferred that significant disappears due to the effect the parental income on transitions event. They have lost their significance. So as a result, before the result, this shows that complementary analysis. We try to some more significant effect up to variables. So we used panel analysis to confirm the relationship between parental income and transition events. So parents' income also influence their children's transition event. Graduate 4 years at university, full-time job, or marriage and living so 1 year. And using panel data, it was observed that young adult children of low-income parents were less likely to experience transition events. So as a result, the main findings here, the first one, the burden effect was not clear. And second, buffer effect is a little bit more clear. Young people from high-income household experience independence at a later age, and this period becomes longer in proportional to their income. Parental income also affects transition events other than independence. In particular, marriage is closely related to independence. This is the phenomena in South Korea. Young people can experience an unequal life course depending on their parents' income. And the implications and limits. The delays in achieving independence can have negative effect not only on young people, but also on their parents, because they got the very same household income, and younger children have a very difficult time in young adult in South Korea. So there is a need to consider social policies aimed at supporting that transition to vulnerable young individuals who face challenges in achieving independence. And you can show that the South Korean welfare state do not have much security system for young adults in South Korea. So we need the stepping stone project can be the good solutions for young adults with their problems in independence from their parents or caring their parents. Thank you for listening my research.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bjorn. That was fascinating and important. And thank you to all of our panelists who shared their expertise with us today. We will now start with the question and answer portion of our webinar. We have 2 prepared questions, a third if we have extra time. I'm going to read the first question and then we can answer them in the order that we presented, beginning with Kirsten, then going to Pasi, Mira, and Gimson. And that question, which I will then put into the chat also, is the first question. In today's changing labor and social environment, what kinds of vulnerability remain overlooked by current social welfare and guaranteed income policies? And how might policy design or administrative systems be improved to address these emerging gaps? I'm putting that in the chat. And if you care to answer this one, I will start with Kirsten Sembach.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the most important thing that we overlook is we tend to think about welfare policies sort of from a poverty perspective without really taking into account the employment situation of workers and this cumulative aspect that I mentioned before. So I think it's absolutely crucial to, on the one hand, measure who's got poor quality employment and reach, consensus on how we can define that in a particular location, and then take into account this cumulative effect. So people who have low income often also have other circumstances within their employment situation, but also within their personal lives that compound poverty, inequality, and often lead to traps. So, for example, the classic example of this is these welfare to work policies that have become increasingly popular. What they tend to do is they push people into the next bad job. And those people then become stuck in a cycle of short-term, frequently rotating, low-income jobs and can't get out of that. And that traps them in a very, very vulnerable situation. Rather than investing in their capabilities and in their training so that they can actually help themselves out of the situation. So one of the key problems with this, of course, is that costs a lot of money. And at the moment, one of the big problems that we have worldwide is that our data availability on labour markets is very, very poor, especially in some countries more than others. So Finland is an example of where we have administrative data that actually is very, very helpful in analysing trends at a very granular level. So, for example, you can take that data down to the local level. I have used data like that also for Chile, which is why I know that when people have precarious jobs in between, they stop contributing, they stop paying taxes and so on. And the fiscal implications of this are very, very significant for the state, for the local government, etc. And we're not really measuring that properly. And therefore, our policies are just like stopgap solutions. They're like sticking a plaster on a rather larger wound.
Dr. Moisio, if you care to answer.
Yes, apologies, we went in order. Well, perhaps, like I mentioned in my presentation, I'm giving a comment from the Finnish or Nordic context, where what is overlooked in these guaranteed income policies or systems. Perhaps I'm talking about the system that is highly digitalized and very right-based, meaning that it's considered to be a bit passive, cash-only guaranteed income that is delivered through internet, digital means without face-to-face contact. So in our experience, we have found that this kind of a system works very well for a majority of people. But for people who have special needs and who might need some counseling and face-to-face talk or guidance, this kind of a highly digitalized income guaranteed income system kind of leaves behind alone in a sense. So in kind of Finnish or Nordic experiences that you need a services. You have a high quality services, social services, educational and active labor market services to back up the highly digitalized guaranteed minimum income system if you have one. Otherwise, you risk that those who are not, for those who just cash is not the solution or the only problem. They fell on the crack and are left without. And also, you face the work incentives deteriorating when you have a high right-based guaranteed income system running through internet or through digital system, and you don't have this kind of what am I called checkups, what's going on there, and etc. etc. Yeah, but I said these are the kind of fine-tuning issues that you faced. Perhaps you need to prepare to face once you have this highly digitalized guaranteed income system. But for a stepping stone project, I would definitely look carefully of these two risks that is kind of a highly digitalized safety net system that you are planning to establish will create. You have people who need more than just cash, and then you have work incentives traps, so to speak. That the Danes always say that they have tough love, so they meaning that they have a high social security, but they handle the unemployment traps and work incentive problems by very strict conditionality and obligations to participate in the active in the labor market programs and all kind of services. So that is kind of a Nordic lesson, if I want to say that if you want to have a high-level social security and right-based guaranteed income system, you need to have a lot of services for those who need more than cash benefits, but also to maintain the work incentives. Yeah, thank you.
From the perspective of somebody who studies care and migration, I think firstly, there's a lot of discussion about, like I presented, how does GI rectify caregiver burdens? And, a lot of the time when we talk about GI, we ask, can it facilitate labor exit? So exit from precarious working conditions? Can it enable people to find jobs that are more stable? But when it comes to unpaid care work, which is labor, you can't really exit the family. And so when you have those family responsibilities, when you have those gendered obligations, particularly for women to care for their families, GI doesn't necessarily facilitate a sort of exit or a protest of the responsibilities that they have as caregivers and the burdens that they then take on. And so I think one thing we really need to consider is how do we, and this is, I think we'll discuss this later in the session as well, but how do we facilitate a reorganization of care and a redistribution of care? Because I don't think GI can do that alone. It can't change gender norms on its own. It can potentially help, but I think there needs to be a lot more things that we do as a society to recognize the gendered burdens of care for women, and try and reorganize that so that GI can actually facilitate, I'm not saying an exit as in people will still care for their families, they want to, they love their families, but to facilitate more autonomy in how they do that. And so I think that's something that, GI research really needs to consider, because as we found in Los Angeles, women were still the primary caregivers for their families. The GI helped them to do that, but they weren't really able to use the cash for other things other than care. And I think the second thing from an immigration and particularly in the US perspective, and this is not necessarily something that GI is overlooking, I think it's just something that we have to contend with, is that for immigrant families, particularly for people who live in mixed status households, there are a lot of administrative burdens that they navigate daily in terms of trying to access benefits. And especially in the US right now, there are a lot of ways that people are being denied access to those benefits because they're immigrants. And GI can provide some material security, but it can't change the way that the system is set up against immigrants. It can't change the stress and the anxiety and the fear that comes from being an immigrant in a context where there's so much rising anti-immigration sentiment, where people are almost afraid to access benefits because they don't want their status to be, revealed to people that might, try and retaliate against them. And so I think we also have to consider, how is GI functioning in a context where it's really, really difficult to be a low-income, marginalized immigrant individual who is trying to access services, and how does GI contend with those things? Thank you.
Dr. Byun, do you have anything to add to this question?
I have one question, Dr. Moisio. You talk about the fine-tuning in welfare system in Finland. And can you talk about a little more specific system changes?
Put it in a nutshell, for social assistance system, the state level social assistance system, which is practically digitalized household level guaranteed minimum income. They introduced more conditions and obligations to report yourself as an unemployed job seeker to the unemployment office, for example. That was a major reform, and that similar kind of thing. So it's more obligation, because the guaranteed minimum income system is just a cash benefit system. So they are making conditional that the guaranteed minimum income system is the last resort, meaning that you need to apply your other benefits, like unemployment benefits first, and that way you are included in the unemployment services and other services that come to the benefits. So it's more conditions and face-to-face, and also the other part is they increasing the face-to-face contacting, and they are trying to introduce the Danish flexicurity model, if you want to say. The Denmark is the kind of a prime example that most of the Nordic countries try to follow. Yes.
Okay, thank you all. Let's move on to our second question. How do you see unpaid care work as being connected to the notion of dependence? And in your view, how might expanding the social responsibility for care help promote greater individual self-reliance? And let's go in the same order and start with Kirsten again.
Yes, I really appreciate this question, because it really goes to a key point, and yeah, as the last presentation did as well. It was Myra's presentation did as well. We have much less information on what's going on in the unpaid sector than we do even in the paid sector. So if our information and data on labour markets isn't very good, it's even worse on anything to do with unpaid care work. And so that complicates the design of public policies in this area. The one thing I would say is there are plenty of countries that do have institutionalized universal care systems, so what in the US would be called long-term care insurance, and they do work. They are chronically underfunded because the population is aging and their needs are increasing. And so this notion of dependence, if you are caring for somebody, is a big issue everywhere, but it's particularly an issue in those countries where this infrastructure isn't guaranteed or universally funded. So I would urge any policymaker to sort of think along those lines. In particular, there are secondary effects of this, and I think this came through in the presentations as well. If you are taking care of people, it affects not only your ability to go out and earn an independent wage, but it will also have consequences on your own health, in particular your social networks, your mental health, and it will reduce your future earnings. So if you're caring for somebody and then that person, especially if it's an elderly parent, at some point passes on, it will have significantly affected your chances of re-entering the labour market. And we should look at this with much more care and much more detail. In Scandinavian countries, again, my understanding is that we have much better data on these things. And in Europe, there are universal systems in most countries, but they are more or less generous, basically following the lines of the welfare state models that Pasi outlined. And so I think this is one of the biggest areas that we need to work on going forwards, especially tends to be implemented at the local level. So it's often municipal governments or municipal administrations that are actually undertaking these services. And so it's one of those issues where it's even harder to measure what's going on because we often don't have municipal level data. So yeah, this is a key area that everybody should focus on. But I think we should look at not just the actual care situation itself, but also the sort of subsequent consequences for the carer in the labour market.
Do I continue now?
Please go ahead, Pasi. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Very good comments, and especially I agree with the previous commentator that the long-term care is issue that it's still overlooked, and like was mentioned, the Finland, Nordic countries, most of the European countries have a universal long-term care systems, but they are of course under budget all the time. But in general, the old care, long-term care for old care and the policy is more on supported housing. At least in the Nordic countries, the kind of a policy is being that it's always better and of course economically also better to provide services to old people's their own home, and that way provide them that they can live in their own home as long as possible. Some have made calculation that even 3 or even 4 visits a day by a social or local caretaker, it is still considering the public finance, it's still more economical than the long-term care in the institution. So that's kind of give you figures. But we didn't talk about the childcare on the other end of the life circle, and the childcare is, I think, it's a different thing. It's many European countries have a universal one, or at least highly subsidized. Finland has highly subsidized. It's not completely free unless you are low income, but it's highly. But it's more easier, and it's a much bigger because it's seen as mostly as a tool that provides women the possibility to work. So it's also an economic factor. It's not just considering the equality, but also economic big impact for young women in their best working age are able to work. And because of the birth rates in Europe, it's also the cost seems to be getting lower because there's a smaller and smaller cohorts entering the daycare centers. And also the daycare centers are more and more seen as the most important inclusion policy and then programs, because it's the best way to integrate especially the second generation immigrants, especially in countries that are non-English speaking, coming from the small language families. So that means that you actually have to put a lot of efforts of language studies for immigrants to learn it. So that's why the childcare is a bit of a much more positive situation, and in the unpaid care work situation. Sorry, I was a bit of a babbling. Hopefully got some points in my comments. Thank you. I leave it to you, Nina. Sorry.
Mira, do you have anything to add to this one?
I think I would definitely echo a lot of what Dr. Senbrook said. Our lack of understanding of what's going on in the unpaid care economy. To take a more theoretical approach, Martha Feynman talks about derivative dependency, which is the dependency that people who care for others experience as a result of these lacks of support. So I think that what Dr. Senbrook said is very important. I think, want to problematize a little bit the term self-reliance. I think from my perspective and the perspective of CGIAR, we are trying to promote people's autonomy in being able to make decisions about how they spend their time, both their working time, their leisure, the time that they spend caring for their families. But I think the term self-reliance, I think, puts a little bit too much of an onus on this sort of neoliberal or capitalism idea of individualism, of entrepreneurialism. And I don't think dependency is a bad thing. I don't think relying on social supports, or not relying, but having access to social supports is a bad thing. I think that it can actually increase people's autonomy in how they spend their time and how they spend their resources. And so I think that's really important. And I also think part of reorganizing and reevaluating how we approach care is recognizing that we are all mutually interdependent. We will at some point be providing care. We all have at some point have been cared for. And so if we recognize that, I think that we understand then the importance of care. And so I just really wanted to kind of, problematize what we mean by self-reliance, and that it's not necessarily a bad thing, and that having the ability to make choices, I think, is probably maybe a better way to put it. And if that means that somebody decides, I would rather prioritize caring for my family than working and reduce their working time, I think that's good, and we want that. But then at the same time, if somebody decides that they want to, go back into the labor market, like a mother wants to go back into the labor market and have the ability to afford childcare, that's also good. But I don't think that, making use of social services such as GI necessarily means that you're not self-reliant in the way that I think we're discussing. Yes, from dependency to interdependence, Nina.
Fabulous, Mira. Thank you. Gimson?
Yeah. It's really difficult question, and I agree all of your answers. And I think that care work reveals the fundamental in the interdependence of human life and their whole life. But the modern welfare state has long treated dependency as a negative thing, and we need to handle that problem. Is not the natural thing. So it's really hard to solve that problem things, but not the problem. Unpaid caregivers, often women, occupy a paradoxical position in Korea, especially. They manage others' dependence in Korea while becoming economically and socially dependent themselves. And this contradiction exposes the moral or structural welfare systems. And therefore, expanding the social responsibility of care is not about increasing dependence. It's about equalizing dependency. And I think that in Korea, we have a lot of social services to provide their some burdens of family care of their own child or their father or mother. But in Korea, we have a lot of problems of dependence and independence from the relationship between of them. So it's a long questions, but we have no specific solutions in South Korea. We have more research, and we need more good solutions and welfare systems. And I really think about that problem or that issues in South Korea, but it's really hard to conclusions in South Korean welfare system, and we have a lot of welfare services and for young child and their old mother and fathers and long-term caregivers, but it's really hard to solve that problem. So in stepping stone project, we have only a cash benefit in our program, but we try to connect other services or other caregivers to help them to work or to find other education opportunities. So we have to research about that solutions, and we need to more research about that. Yeah.
Thank you, Gibson. I'm going to pose our third question here since we have a little bit of time, but I'm going to challenge you all to answer it briefly in 1 or 2 sentences, because it's a big question. What do you see as the number one most critical direction of change that welfare policy should pursue going forward? So narrowing it down. And I guess anyone who's ready to answer this one can jump in.
I can start because I'm writing a book on this. I think the most important thing to think about going forwards is the pace at which our labour markets are changing with regard to AI technology, but also other developments such as working from home. There are so many changes going on at the moment. At the same time, this is more than labour markets have ever experienced. And our welfare systems aren't really set up for dealing with this. So the question really is whether they are sustainable. So in those slides that I showed you about poor quality employment, that those workers are really in precarious conditions and they don't really contribute continuously either to social security systems or to through taxes, through fiscal systems. And personally, I know that it's really important to distinguish between different welfare state types, sorry, like the typologies that Pasi mentioned. But at the end of the day, they're all building on our labour markets. And if our labour markets change, we need to think about how sustainable our welfare policies are, in particular when it comes to thinking about how in the future, if we have huge job displacements as a result of technology or higher levels of unemployment, we need to think about different policies, in particular those that help workers retrain or face new jobs. So that's the number one key issue. Everybody kind of says this, but I haven't really seen any government really think about this going forward. The other thing that I need to think about, and this is sort of a bigger picture issue, is we need to think about how we're distributing employment and also not just the quantity of jobs, but also the quality of jobs. So what I mean by that is going forwards, if there are changes to the labour market that are so substantial through technology, hopefully with the end result that people become more productive, we need to think about whether we can reduce working hours so that employment is distributed more broadly. And we need to think about whether at the moment we have so many enshrined inequalities in the labour market because people with different contracts or different types of employment relationships have completely different rights, not just within the labour market, but also often to social security services. So we really need to think about distributional issues and inequality in this context of future technologies, etc. Yeah, I know autonomy is a component of the American dream and it's an absolutely key issue. One of the things that workers who get displaced by future technologies will find is that they are no longer receiving the benefits from work that contribute to their mental health. So, the autonomy over their actions might be erased. They may not have the regular schedules that help us all function in the world. They may not be feeling as though they're making the same contribution to the world. And we know that all of these things affect both physical and also mental, especially mental health. So we need to really think about, we can't have a huge amount of people employed in really, really good productive jobs and then others employed in bad jobs without rights or entitlements or with reduced rights and entitlements. So we need to think about how we distribute this going forwards.
Jump in. I think this is more of a normative answer, though it has policy implications, but how do we imbue a welfare system? I'm really talking about the US context that does not promote hierarchies of deservedness, that promotes people's dignity, their humanity, The US welfare context is very stigmatizing. It's based around pushing people into precarious work and surveilling them. And so my biggest concern, especially in this context in the US, as we all know, is how do we get away from that? And how do we promote a welfare system that is recognizing people's humanity?
Perhaps me now. Thank you. I'm following my previous comment that the financing is perhaps, and it comes to social contribution. Well, most of our welfare, at least the work pensions and major part of the welfare systems in different regimes are based on social contributions. And like previously said, labor markets are changing, and it's giving a big issue that how we finance the welfare system if you don't have labor markets that can be paid by provide financing via social contribution. And that's why it's also very linked question about the regulation of labor markets. You have to remember that welfare state started, the building of the welfare state, at least in Europe, it started by labor regulation, not by benefits or services. So it's especially the platform work and that kind of issues. And I think that I don't know, that at least it's one of the major questions. What will be the regulation of the future labor markets, and what will be the based on financing if social contributions are more and more difficult to extract? Will it be then tax funded? And the third and last one, I think it's about a public support and kind of a narrative of the welfare state or security in more mobile immigration countries. I mean, the risk pool of the welfare state or social insurance, which one will say it. It used to be quite simple and clear, but and the narrative of the national state was, supporting the building up the welfare systems, and those are gone or more or less. So the big question is in the future is that what kind of a welfare state or welfare arrangement we will have in countries that don't have a full employment anymore. We mentioned here, labor markets are more perhaps unregulated because of platform work. You have multiculturalism, you have high mobility, you have immigration. People don't live and die and work in the same geographic location anymore. So that's it's also considering the pension obligation. That's causing a lot of big questions. So yeah, so I would say that financing, regulation, and the kind of public support of who gets what. Yeah, thank
you. Yeah, could I just add something to what Pasi was saying, because I think this is really important. When we started thinking about setting up welfare states, they were originally designed to support people when they couldn't work anymore. So if you were retired and too old, or if you were sick and couldn't work, or for whatever reason. Originally also caring responsibilities, for example, if you were a single mother and so on. So that was the original logic with which we support people, and we still apply this logic. But what we're finding, and what I'm seeing in the UK data, but I think this is a Europe-wide phenomenon, is that 50% of the recipients of our benefit payments now in the UK are actually in work. So these are people who are working, but who literally can't make ends meet, and who are working under such conditions that they need additional support from the state. And so we've moved to a model where we've flexibilized our labour markets, we've generated quite a few precarious jobs, and now governments are having to step in to support these workers and support this flexibility. The end result of which is we are subsidizing companies to employ people under really poor employment conditions. And I think that needs to be said. It needs to be said explicitly, and it needs to be considered in how we construct welfare benefits and think about welfare systems as well, because this is no longer a world in which we're supporting people who are out of work. We're also supporting people who are in work. And I think the COVID crisis in particular showed that very clearly, but it's a continued phenomenon. And the other thing is that when welfare states fail, or when benefit systems fail, when health systems fail, we're already experiencing in the advanced countries a decline in the labor force. We're missing workers. A lot of people have had to leave, especially since COVID, the labor force, or have left the labor force, either because they don't want to put up with poor employment conditions, or because they have health issues, or because they can't find jobs that allow them to accommodate for their health issues and continue working. There's a number of things going on. Certainly in the UK, I know this data quite well. I think it's also going on in other European countries. I wouldn't be surprised if the same thing is going on in the United States. So we need to think about accommodating people in the labor market in ways that enable them to continue to work, but also we really need to think about, the setup of our welfare system and whether we should really allow companies to hire people under such conditions that, and at the end of the day, governments have to subsidize them.
Yeah, just want to continue. Those very excellent comment. Yes, actually, it's a bit of a paradox that we have built. At least we're considering the the most extensive welfare state. It's also a bit of a paradox that we have built extensive welfare states with high economic and social rights, but paradoxically, to finance this system, we need to extract all the work and revenues from people possible. So that means that the modern welfare state doesn't have the luxury of letting people to lay back or chill out. It needs to have all the women work long working careers and etc. etc. You don't have a luxury. For example, in Finland and in Nordic, there's a big debate that women don't have possibility to raise their children at home when they are small, because you need workforce. So it's kind of a paradox in a sense. And assume that South Korea with its aging population is facing this kind of a dilemma even stronger than in many European countries, meaning that you need to you cannot leave people alone. You have to push or lure or incentivize them to work as long as possible and more and as much productive work as possible. So it's a bit of a paradox. So just going.
Thanks, Pasi. Kim-sun, do you have anything to add to this question?
That's all.
Wonderful. Well, I do want to acknowledge that we have a few special guests in attendance, Mark Sanders and Sarah Cowan. And if you'd like to give you all an opportunity to introduce yourselves or provide any comments for the participants today, or notes or questions.
Thank you for allowing me to listen in. The conversation was enlightening. The presentations were very thought-provoking. I appreciate the points that everyone is making. The stories and the impact of GBI in LA and San Diego that Ms. Phillips laid out, very similar to what we saw in Chicago, and the challenges that were expressed are very similar to what we see. And the question of how we finance it always continues to come up for me. So it's very interesting to see the different models that Mr. Moisio, sorry, I can't pronounce your name, presented. And so just a lot of great information to consider and think about. And it does give me hope when our city, our country is going through such precarious times. So thank you for the presentation, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness and all of your comments.
Thank you for having me. I want to appreciate Mr. Sanders's calmness. I would say that these are dangerous times, scary times. And I also want to appreciate that the willingness that everyone here has been have to describe what cash transfers basic income can't do. It's not going to, as Ms. Phillips pointed out, reconstitute our family obligations or, change our norms and expectations for each other. No cash transfer policy is going to be able to do that. And I also want to appreciate that in a capitalist society, giving people cash also confers dignity and autonomy and flexibility. And it is the means by which we pay labor, one of the means by which we pay for labor, the most common means. And so it is the tool we should turn to first. Anything else should, cash should be the default, and anything else should be worthy of justification.
Thank you so much to both of you for joining and adding your comments. I once again want to thank the Seoul Metropolitan Government and Yoon Ho Lee for hosting us all together today. This was a wonderful panel, and thank you again to all of our panelists for sharing your insights today. This concludes our webinar, and be well, everyone.